Is your gaming destroying you spiritually? Maybe, but is the act of playing video games evil in and of itself? Will planting pixelated crops drive you away from a growing Christian life? Or will 8-bit friends lead you into a spiritual quagmire? Some people will argue that video games uniquely cause spiritual and mental harm to those who play them. I don't think so. So let's explore video games and the Christian life here on another Open Air Thoughts. From really early on in recorded history, new forms of artistic expression have developed bad reputations. Even new forms of media have gotten bad reputations. Take paper, for instance. The philosopher Socrates had this to say about paper. For this invention will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. They trust in writing, produced by external characters, which are no part of themselves. It will discourage the use of their own memory within them. This was, ironically, passed down on paper through the generations for me to quote, and now this feels kind of absurd, but his statement is not unique in history in general. For instance, Augustine, one of my very favorite early Christians, has this to say about plays in general. A good Christian has no wish to attend the public shows. In this very thing, that he bridles his desire for going to the theater, he cries out after Christ, cries out to be healed. Others run together to the theater, but perhaps they are heathens? Ha! Indeed, if Christians went not to the theaters, there would be so few people there that they would go away for very shame. So then Christians run there also, bearing the holy name only to their condemnation. I can't agree with Augustine's sentiment for today's theaters, but in Augustine's day, the public shows that he was referring to could contain some pretty crazy stuff, which I guess happens in movies today and plays today, but I'm going to assume that it was a lot more common then. Anyways, paganism and wanton morals were regular features in plays of those days. In those days, the theater was an institution rooted in centuries of Greek and Roman tradition, and it was not an easy thing to change. So it is no wonder that the feelings of the early Christians was that of total rejection rather than redemption. But that leads us into categories, something we really need to understand in order to wrap our minds around this topic. Living as a human requires categories. But categories are a hard thing to sort out, and even harder when you start using categories in moral considerations, such as, will this category of thing hurt me? There can be categories in general that are inherently bad for our souls. Sinful actions such as sexual immorality or cheating can fall into a category of their own, sin. And as you engage in sin, you harm your spirit. Categories on their own are pretty simple concepts. We see a grouping of somewhat similar things, and we feel the justification to create a category to group these things. A gala apple and a red delicious apple are both apples. They both taste like, well, apples, only different. They are not the same in texture and tartness, but somehow we still know that they each fit in the category of apple. What does this have to do with plays in the ancient Roman world? Well, let's consider what a play is in categorical terms. It is a human expression of art through narrative storytelling in a stage environment. This may or may not be a good definition, but let's roll with it anyways. It's close enough for our purposes. Can we see the issue now once we start thinking categorically? You can take the above category in a lot of directions. Per the category above, the Christian worldview can't condemn a play as such. It is only when the play category is expressed by a culture that is fundamentally anti-Christian that things go off the rails. So much so that even the category can start to feel sinful itself. But if we examine liturgies throughout the centuries that have been faithfully practiced by our brothers and sisters in Christ, week in and week out, we come up against an uncomfortable realization. A play and a Sunday morning liturgy are eerily similar things. When we follow a well-written liturgy, we are singing, reciting, even replaying through abstracted, meaningful, artful methods, the wonderful sacrifice of the King of Kings on the cross. And just like a well-written and acted play, a liturgy can cut a man to the heart and rend his soul with who Christ is. So categories may not be in and of themselves evil, but rather an evil expression of the category can give the category in a given time a bad reputation. This has happened with other categories of artistic expression as well. Take rap music, for instance. As a brief side note, this will help us understand a trap that we can fall into when interacting with artistic categories. Due to decades of rap artists predominantly using that form of music subcategory as a vehicle for some pretty vile art, rap has taken on a mostly negative connotation within modern Western culture, particularly among us Christians. I have even heard some arguments that rap is fundamentally evil because its beats can be traced back to African tribal music. Not joke, I have heard. This rather disturbing line of eugenics-style reasoning can help us understand a problem Christians commonly face. We can demonize a subcategory based on our own dislike of that subcategory. This is an especially pernicious practice because it often hides itself from the person reasoning, badly I might add, in this way. When you don't like something, you tend to have negative feelings towards what you don't like, which is, it's kind of obvious. And when we have negative feelings towards something and can see examples of an abuse category causing spiritual harm, it is easy to slip into demonizing mode. In this mode of thinking, we commit a part-to-whole fallacy by stretching the evil being committed by some of the artists over the art subcategory as a whole. We can, if we are not careful, succumb to our negative emotional responses to the art form and let those emotions drive us to coming up with all sorts of fallacious conclusions that soothe our strong emotions. It is especially bad when one is erudite. As Alistair McIntyre said in his seminal work, After Virtue, this is great silliness, of course, but it is the great silliness of highly intelligent and perceptive people. It is not the unlearned old man yelling at the booming bass alone who is subject to the demonizing mode of thought. We all have this tendency baked within us. It is only when we are self-conscious of our own tendency to do this will we be able to really resist it. Okay, but what does all of this have to do with video games anyways? Well, to put it simply, video games are a category of recreation. So if we want to dismiss video games out of hand as not profitable for the Christian life, or somehow sinful as a subcategory of recreation, we will face some serious problems with other forms of recreation and art. Every now and again, my son asks me this question: this Steam game is on sale, do you think it'll be worth buying it? My answer is normally, well, would you pay that much to watch a movie? And while this is more suitable in my own family, you could sub out the movie for any other form of spectating recreation. Would you pay that much to attend a football game? Video games are an interesting mixture of art forms. They include writing, visual art, acting, poetry, song, and a myriad of other sub-art forms. This is all combined with a rule set that creates challenge or adversity. As a form of art, they are rather impressive things. Now that we understand video games within their category as a subset of recreation and art, on par with watching sports, playing pickup football, attending a play, or watching a movie, we can answer the questions posed at the outset of this video. Will planting pixelated crops drive you away from a growing Christian life? Or will 8-bit friends lead you into a spiritual quagmire? And the answer is a definite maybe. Video games, understood as existing in the category of recreation, means that all of the Christian wisdom surrounding recreation comes into play. See what I did there? Planting pixelated crops can hurt your walk with Christ if planting pixelated crops becomes an idol to your heart. Remember Calvin's ever-present saying, our hearts are idol factories. And let's couple that with Augustine's fantastic saying, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God. How we respond to recreation matters greatly. And this is when we need to employ Christian wisdom. Fortunately for us, we have been given not only thousands of years of fellow Christian wisdom, but we have been given the ultimate window into wisdom itself, the Bible. Let's take a look at a few verses that can help us create a healthy relationship to video games. 1 Corinthians 6:12. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. 2 Timothy 1:7. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. Here we see Paul giving us a powerful principle. While we are free to do so many things, we should never do something that would enslave us. This applies well to video games, especially because there is a cultural character in the back of all of our heads regarding video game players. That of the slothful monster drinker, living in the dark basement, waiting for the next AAA title to drop. I do not say this in order to propagate this hurtful stereotype, but rather to bring it to your attention that you could be living with this cultural character. And it could be coloring your perception of video games in general in an unfair and fallacious way. When we give in to the cultural character in areas of distaste, our thinking can be easily twisted in all sorts of harmful ways. But with all this talk of moderation and careful control of recreation, we need to include a warning about media in general. Visual and audible art have the capability to be damaging to the soul when they offer alternative outlets for natural inclinations. What does that mean, I hear you say? Well, the easy example would be objects of lust. It is natural for a man or a woman to desire being with someone sexually. So sexual expression within the context that God has designed, namely within a one man and one woman marriage covenant, is not only acceptable, it is a wonderful expression of sexuality, one that is actively encouraged in the Bible. However, when you take sexual expression and offer an alternative outlet to the marriage bed, you fall into tempting the person consuming your media into using that outlet and falling into sin. And the inverse can be true. Men can make an idol out of sports or video games by using these activities as outlets for natural masculine desires to build, conquer, and triumph. When the truest expression of biblical masculinity is to build a family, conquer sin and deprivation, and triumph in the culture for the glory of the Lord and the building of the church and family. Playing video games is no sin. Maybe. Just as rooting for your favorite sports team or playing football is no sin. Maybe. When we play video games, it must be a well-controlled, minor part of our lives, lived for the glory of the Lord. And just as in all things, we need to use Christian wisdom, Christian community, the word that the Lord has given us, as well as keeping all things in our lives in prayer in order to be sure that we are not making an idol out of anything. That includes video game playing. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I really appreciate it. Please be sure to give this a like and subscribe. That really helps the channel. Until next essay, Soli Deo Gloria.